Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be upgrading the cams and valve springs on my B58 engine. You guys might remember a couple months ago we talked about the new Kelford cams that were coming on the market when they officially announced all the specs and different options that were going to be available, and they agreed to send me out a set so that I could create some content for you guys, show you how it's all installed, and we'll also do some testing with it to see how much power the car will put down even on just a stock turbo setup. So I got the Stage 1 Gen 1 B58 upgraded camshafts along with the valve springs, and we're going to be doing this in like a 4-part series. So part 1 will show you how to install the intake cam, part 2 will be the exhaust cam, and then part 3 will be the valve springs. And in the future we'll do a part 4 to show the actual results. We'll get on the dyno, do some custom tuning, and all of that good stuff. So yeah, stick around for all of those videos. Keep in mind, if you've been around on the channel for a while, you know I try to create these DIYs to show you how easy it is to install different parts on your car and what you can do from home. This might not be the case, I'll be completely honest. It was a little tricky, it requires a lot of specialty tools, so this might just give you some motivation to drop it off at a shop. But either way, I thought it would be cool to show you guys how it's done. So yeah, hopefully you find this video useful.
Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future.
Now, I want to put a couple disclaimers out there before we jump into this. So first of all, I did not do this in the order that I would recommend. If you're doing everything, what I recommend doing is removing the intake cam, then the exhaust cam, then the valve springs, and then the installation is the reverse of that. So install the valve springs, then the exhaust cam, then the intake cam. Like I said, I didn't do it that way because I thought it would be easier doing it differently. So you might see different cams pop in and pop out of order and things that you don't expect. Just kind of try to ignore that if you can. Focus on the details of the specific one we're discussing in this video for that step. But if you're doing all of it in a specific order, that's the sequence that I would do it in to give you the easiest time lining up all the timing components and everything when you're completing the job. Another thing is a lot of people ask me how to know which one they should order, if it's Gen 1 or Gen 1.5. And it's pretty easy to see. What you're going to have to do is go to the back of your valve cover and remove the Vanos actuator and put a small mirror back there, and you can see the head of the central valve. So if it is a regular hex head bolt, then that is going to be a Gen 1. If it is a spline head, then it's going to be a Gen 1.5. So that's the easiest way to tell. It does change depending on model years, but I would prefer for you guys just to confirm it by pulling the Vanos actuator and just looking at it. You can tell the difference immediately just by looking at the top of the central valve. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the DIY.
So to start things off, we're going to need to remove our valve cover and our charge pipe to access all the components we need. I've already posted a DIY on how to remove the valve cover, so I'll put a link down in the description. But for now, we'll just fast forward, so swipe, and now we are ready to start removing the cams. So now we are in a position to start replacing the cams, and the principle behind this is pretty simple. You know, your Vanos gears towards the back do not have any timing marks. They are not keyed to the cams. They're actually just bolted to the cam by that central valve. So you're going to need to lock the cams into position in order to set the time on your car, and you lock both of the cams and you lock the crank as well. And then you can mess with the timing chain stuff in order to, you know, swap out these components. So there are a lot of special tools. I'll show you guys that as we go through it, but if you need the tools, there will be a link down in the description where you can buy the exact kit that I'm using so you know that you have all the tools you need. So at this point, we need to set the engine to top dead center, and that requires accessing the crank pulley, and we can't do that with this fan shroud in place. So we're going to go ahead and remove it. The first step is to unplug this wiring harness that's going to the fan shroud. And then once you've unplugged it, there is a little clip holding it onto the shroud. So you're just going to use a small screwdriver to pop that clip off, and then we can tuck the wiring harness out of the way. Then we're going to need to remove the fan shroud straight up out of the engine bay. There's usually a screw on the passenger side. Mine is missing, but if you have that, go ahead and remove it. And then on the driver's side of the bay, there is a little clip that's holding a tab on the fan shroud in place. So I'm sticking a flathead screwdriver in there to push the tab down, and then that allows you to pull the fan straight up. Keep in mind there are a lot of hoses here. Everything is in the way. It's not easy, so just take your time, kind of tilt it around and shake it until it fully comes up and out of the engine bay. Now I like to stick something down the spark plug hole in order to easily identify top dead center. If you have something thin enough, you might be able to put it down the fuel injector hole, but I don't. So I went ahead and removed the spark plug, and after you've pulled it out, you can put something down the hole. Like in my case, I'm using a long flathead screwdriver, and that just makes sure that you can see the position of the piston while you're turning the crank. And then this is the actual timing kit. So this is everything that you get with that kit that I post from Amazon, and it comes with a lot of stuff. It has stuff to hold down the cams, to line up the crank. It even has this piece that is technically supposed to be used to remove the Vanos actuator, so I haven't really used it, but that's what that's for. So to start things off, we are going to use this piece, and this will actually fit down here on the crank. And then we can use that to actually turn the crank and find top dead center. Now this is where things are going to look out of order a little bit, because I had already removed the exhaust cam, and then I realized that wasn't the best thing, so I'll explain why in a little bit. But first we'll remove the intake cam, and we need to basically back off the Valvetronic motor as much as possible. So we unplug the harness connector, and then you're going to put a 4mm Allen key into the little hole on top of it and just unscrew it until it stops. And you can see while I'm unscrewing it, it's actually backing off that eccentric shaft, so you can see it actually turning. And once it's fully removed, you should see all of the secondary rockers basically in this kind of orientation. But yeah, just turn it until it stops, and that lets you know that you've relieved as much pressure as possible. Next, we're going to remove the Valvetronic springs, and of course there is a special tool for this, so here's what the tool looks like. Again, I'll have a link down in the description if you guys are interested in buying the one that I got. But the spring will sit in this notch. You can kind of see where it coils up, so that's going to tuck into the notch on the tool. And then on the legs, it has this little relief, or this little like cutout, and the legs on the spring are going to tuck into the legs on the tool. So I'll show you guys exactly how you can mount it up to remove the spring. So here you can see I'm basically nestling the coiled part of the spring into the little notch on the tool, and then I'm also making sure that the legs line up with the legs on the spring. So as you close it together, it should lock onto one leg on each side of the spring, and then when you squeeze it, it locks into place and it holds the coil under tension, and then you should just be able to pull it off. But this is where I realized I screwed up. If you remove the exhaust cam, then there are going to be some cylinders where the intake cam is turned towards the eccentric shaft, and it is not allowing you the space you need to pull these springs out. And you can see here the cam is pointed almost over and down towards the eccentric shaft. So if you're having this issue, I recommend just turning the crank so that you can turn the intake cam until that cam lobe is pointed in a different direction, and that'll just give you way more room to pull this off so you're not fighting with it like I was. Now, to release the spring, there is a tool from BMW that helps give you a little bit of support so that you can slowly relieve the tension, but it's not that hard to do even without that tool. Basically, you just squeeze the two arms together, release the lock, and then slowly relieve the spring pressure. And you can see it's pretty controlled if you just take your time. And then the spring itself is going to be kind of clipped into there, so you have to unhook it. And then you're going to carefully place it with the rest of the springs in the order that they were removed. so that you can reinstall it in the same position. And now we'll go back to setting cylinder 1 to top dead center. So we're going to use the tool with a socket wrench and just keep turning the crank. The piston is going to go down to the bottom of its stroke, and then it's going to come all the way up to the top of its stroke. And while you're turning it, you'll actually see the screwdriver stop moving for a second, and that lets you know that it's pretty much at top dead center. Now, BMW also included a couple other indicators so you can make sure the cams are in the right position. On the exhaust cam, it should say this BMW A. You should see that pointed straight up. And on the intake cam, it should say BMW E. Again, pointed straight up so that you know it's in the right position. You can also look where the cams are going to be locked down. There should be like a flat, and that should be parallel with the flat of your cylinder head. So again, that should be pointed straight up if you're looking at it from this angle. And then lastly, you can just kind of look at the lobes on cylinder 1. So here's what the intake cam looks like, and here's what the exhaust cam looks like. So just make sure your cam lobes are matched up to how this looks. Next, we're going to put down the cam locking tool. So the first thing is this big bracket that hovers over everything, and there are 2 long screws. These are going to go through some of the holes for the valve cover. So you're basically going to screw this down behind it, and that will hold it in place. And then you're going to put 2 brackets, one on each of the cams. The short bracket is going to go on the intake cam, and then you have 2 screws on top that hold that down. Just slide the bracket back and forth if you need to in order to line up the holes. And then on the exhaust cam, you're going to use one of the long brackets. And then same thing, put the 2 screws on top, and that will hold it in place. It only really needs to be finger tight. You don't need to torque it down to a specific specification. Next, we're going to need to access the tensioner, and that requires removing the heat shield on top of the turbo. So in order to access it, we're going to pull these O2 sensor harness wires out of the way, and then you're going to undo the bolts that are holding the heat shield in place. I can't remember, they're either T40 or T45, but unscrew those, and then you can pull the heat shield off. And now we can access the tensioner. So it's way back behind cylinder 6. You can see it basically just looks like a bolt in the side of the block. So you're going to get a 21mm socket in order to unscrew that. I can't really show it on camera just because of the location, but reach back there with your socket and you can unscrew it. And this is how it looks when it's removed. You can basically see again, it just looks like a bolt, and oil pressure pushes that piston out to keep tension on the chain. And just make sure you have some paper towels underneath it because a lot of oil is going to come out and you want to minimize that mess. But yeah, it's that easy. Now at this point, I recommend just taking a video as evidence of how everything is installed. Anything that you remove needs to be sequenced and laid out so that you can reinstall it in the exact same order. The numbers on there don't matter. Sometimes they have different part numbers and stuff. What's most important is the sequence and the orientation of each of these caps, the springs, the covers. Everything that you're removing needs to be reinstalled the exact same way that it was removed. So if you take a video like this, it just gives you a little more assurance. If you get things mixed up slightly, then you can make sure that you reinstall it correctly. Now again, for all the Gen 1 B58 owners, there are 2 different types of central valves. If you're like me and you have the Gen 1 version, you're going to need a 22mm socket in order to remove it. If you have a Gen 1.5, then you're going to need this adapter in order to remove it. And this comes with the timing kit, so you don't need to buy it separately. So yeah, just make sure you get the kit so you have all the tools you need. Now, at this point, I was really struggling. I just underestimated how tight the central valves were. I put the 22mm socket on there square, and I still couldn't get it off. So I ended up removing this part of the firewall. There are 2 Torx screws and a couple 10mm nuts that you need to remove. And then you can pull off this upper firewall plastic. It's just kind of tucked in here on the passenger side, and basically just remove the part that was in my way. Now, even then, I still wasn't quite able to get enough leverage, but this gave me enough room to get my breaker bar in here. So I pulled out Lucille and basically put her behind the hood so I could get enough leverage, and that allowed me to break these central valves free. Once it's broken free, you can finish unscrewing the central valve by hand, and here you can see what it looks like. It basically has a threaded body, a couple holes in the side so that oil can flow in and out, and it has a screen at the base so it can make sure no deposits go where they shouldn't go. And then you can slide off the Vanos gear from the cam. Now, keep in mind there's not a lot of space here with all of the timing lock components and stuff in place, so just take your time, be patient, and you should be able to get it off of the timing chain. Now, these do have to be reinstalled on the correct cam, and you can tell which one is which because, like here you see on the intake Vanos gear, there is an IN for intake, so you can make sure that you put that back on the correct cam. And if you look at the exhaust gear, you can see that it has EX for exhaust. So again, that'll just help ensure you put it back in the right spot. And now we can remove the timing tools. So you'll go ahead and unscrew those 2 screws from each bracket, lift it off, and then you can unscrew the 2 screws that are holding the main mount in place and then remove the mount as well. Next, we're going to remove each of these gates, and they're simply held in by one T40 screw. So you're going to grab your Torx bit and unscrew those. Keep in mind these gates are holding the secondary rockers in place, so once you unscrew these, it's pretty normal for the rockers to kind of fall over or move around. That's no big deal because as soon as you remove the gate, you're going to go back and remove the rockers as well, and just make sure that you store them all again in the same order that they were removed so you can reinstall them in the same locations. Next, we're going to remove all the cam caps, and BMW specifies a tightening sequence, and for the removal, they specify that you need to do the reverse of the tightening sequence. So we're going to start from the outside and kind of zigzag and work our way in, just like pretty much any other tightening sequence. And then we can remove each of the cam caps. Again, make sure you're keeping them organized so that you can reinstall them all in the same location and orientation. And then finally, we can remove the cam itself by just lifting it straight up. And here are all of the intake cam parts laid out and organized. This is kind of an idea of what it should look like. So again, you know that everything can be in the right sequence and orientation for installation. And now we pull out the intake cam from Kelford. Of course, it was packaged very well. You can see it's completely surrounded by bubble wrap, and then inside the bubble wrap, it's individually packaged in this plastic. So that will keep it from getting any damage, any debris, dirt, dust, anything that could cause issues with it during the install. So that's really great. Now that we've taken it out of the plastic, we do need to transfer the trigger wheel from the stock intake cam to the Kelford cam, and this wheel is used by the car to tell the cam position. It's attached onto the cam by this Allen screw, so you're going to use an Allen key to unscrew that and pull it off. You have to basically slide it forward, and then it comes straight off of the cam. Installation onto the Kelford cam is the same. You slide it over the thinner area, then slide it down on the cam so that it fits over that little lobe space. And you can see on the back it's keyed, so you need to rotate it until the flat areas line up, and then pull it down even further and it snaps into place. And then once it's in position, you can put the Allen screw onto the wheel to tighten it onto the new Kelford cam. Now, installation is mostly the reverse of removal, except one big thing you need to pay attention to is protecting your new cylinder head components. So you can see I'm basically applying oil to all the mating surfaces. This makes sure that there's no metal on metal contact and just reduces any friction that could cause scoring or damage to the camshafts. Now, the Kelford cams do come with assembly lube, and that's what's recommended. The lube is a little bit tacky, so that helps make sure it stays in place, and it just gives you superior protection on that initial start. But for me, since I knew my car was going to be running in the next 24 hours, it wasn't as critical for me to use the assembly lube. The oil worked fine, and the assembly lube also can clog up your oil filter, so it's a good idea to make sure you replace your oil within 50 miles if you do use that assembly lube, and then again after another 300 to 500 miles just to make sure it's fully flushed out of your system. I didn't feel like dealing with that, so I just put oil on everything, lubricated it up as much as possible, and like I said, I made sure that my car was running less than 24 hours, so any oil that's draining back down the cylinder head or anything like that wasn't risking me losing that protection. And then we can go ahead and drop in the cams, just double check everything, make sure that it's fully seated on all of those bearings. And next we're going to put the caps on, and again, they get the same treatment. Put your oil, assembly lube, whatever you're using, all over it to minimize the friction between those components when you do your first start. We're going to hand tighten the screws just to get everything in place and seated, and then we're going to start torquing the bolts. I will have all the torque specs in the description, but I did get a smaller torque wrench because these torque specs are so low. It was kind of hard for me to get a good audible click with this bigger wrench. So I recommend getting a smaller one that can measure inch pounds or less than, 30 Newton meters for this kind of job. Next, we need to put the engine back in time, and in order to do that, we're going to jack up the front of the car and remove the under tray underneath the engine so that we can access the crank and lock it at top dead center. Now, there are two different ways that you can do this. If you have an automatic car, you're going to need to remove this starter so that we can access the flywheel, and then we put a pin through it so that it locks it at top dead center. If you have a manual transmission car, then you're going to be looking for this yellow plug on the side of the engine, and you're basically going to use that same pin, but push it through that hole when you put the car at top dead center, and that will lock the crank. So since we have an automatic car, we're going to remove the starter. There are two nuts that need to be loosened on the front to remove these cables. And then once you've removed that, there are 3 eTorx bolts that need to be removed. And you can see they're pretty long, but once you pull those bolts out, then the starter should just drop straight down. Next, we're going to mount up the alignment bracket for the locking pin, and there should be 2 bolts inside of your timing kit that will screw this onto the bottom of your engine, and this just makes sure that the locking pin is aligned to the correct position to make sure your crank is at top dead center. Luckily, I already had the crank pretty much at top dead center, so you can see the hole is right there. I just had to give it a couple of nudges in the right direction until I was able to push the pin all the way in and lock it. Next, you're going to reattach your timing tools so that you can put your Vanos gear on and tighten down your Vanos central valve. Now, the actual torque spec will vary depending on which central valve you have. If you have the Gen 1 version like me, then you're going to torque it to 30 Newton meters, then 50 Newton meters, then it gets a 65-degree angle of rotation, and I actually had to pull Lucille back out to get that angle because it goes to a crazy amount of torque. At this point, it definitely made more sense why it was so hard to remove. If you have the spline head or the Gen 1.5 version, you're going to need to torque it to 50 Newton meters and then torque it to 140 Newton meters. So again, just pay attention to the torque spec based on the central valve your car has. Finally, you'll reinstall your timing chain tensioner, and then you're done with all the timing tools, so you can remove those screws and take the brackets off. Next, we're going to put the intermediate rockers back in place. Again, go crazy with, your lubricant of choice just to make sure that you're minimizing any metal-to-metal contact and reducing the friction. Then you're basically going to want to hold the rockers with one hand while you install the gates with the other hand. So you'll just place the gates back in place in their order and then put a screw through the middle to hold it in place and just keep it hand tight for now. At this point, it's a good idea to double check all of the rockers and make sure that they're sitting properly in the channels in your gates. That's what's going to make sure that they're actually aligned and working properly. So make sure that they're all seated in the correct position. Next, we're going to tighten down the gates, but the problem here is that they basically start to turn a little bit, and they need to be aligned properly in order for the cylinder head to work without an issue. So when they turn and shift and create that gap, there is a special tool that BMW provides to hold it in place. So when you're tightening it down, it can stay completely up tight to the rest of the cylinder head. But I didn't have that tool, so I just used some C-clamps and held it down, made sure that that corner was as flush as possible, and then I tightened it to the recommended torque spec. Next, we're going to reinstall the Valvetronic springs, And just like everything else, installation is basically the reverse of removal. So we're going to open up the clamp on the specialty tool, and then you're going to take your spring and kind of hook it underneath that clip and make sure it's as centered as possible. So when you close it, you're able to line up the legs on the tool with the legs on the spring. So it should basically just sit in those little recesses on the tool, and then you simply close it slowly until it locks into place. And then we're going to go and install it on the cam. And again, remember, at this point, you should have the exhaust cam and the crank and everything linked together. So if you need to turn the cam a little bit in order to add some clearance so the spring fits in there smoothly, this is the time to turn your crank. There are probably at least 2 cylinders where it'll create too much interference. But you can see here, I had the cam lobe out of the way, so the spring dropped right in. And then all you need to do is squeeze on the handles, release the lock, and then slowly release the handle so that the torsion spring goes back into position. And then we're going to want to get down and check on the rockers to make sure the legs of the springs are appropriately tucked into the rockers in those little recesses, because that again is going to be necessary for the cylinder head to work properly. So at this point, we basically just need to reassemble everything. You put your valve cover back on, reassemble your ignition system and your fuel system. One thing I do recommend is doing a prime. So leave your injectors unplugged, go back in the car, press the start button, and let it crank for 10 seconds or so. That will drive the mechanical oil pump so that it pushes oil through all the galleys, and again just helps make sure that all of your components are lubricated before it revs up to thousands of RPM, and that should help you get the reliability you need out of these new upgraded cams. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.